Well, to begin this video with a bit of a tangent, which I'll admit to doing quite a bit, I made some comments on a video about Germany, and I like to make fun of Germans because there's just certain elements within German society that I find particularly servile and repulsive. And I always find it ironic because the traits that made all the bad things in the past possible and happen are still there. Uh, so, but there's a misattribution where people think that, well, as long as you're not racist, uh, then it's okay. Well, no, it's not okay. And the Germans are still obedient authoritarians who will, by and large, obey their government. And I've always found this annoying. And anyway, not to be too collectivistic about it, I have German friends who are pretty libertarian, and not to exonerate Americans as being somehow all fiercely independent individualists. Hardly the case, although I think that there's a tendency that it's more that way than in, say, Germany. Anyway, and I'll make comments on videos, and the Germans are servile, they're authoritarians, they're bad, and I'll always get a response from somebody I don't know, obviously, who will say, you don't know what you're talking about, things have changed, and I'll say, well, but Germany still outlaws things like homeschooling and the right to bear arms and free speech, actually, and even the freedom of religion. I mean, some churches are subsidized, and other churches are banned as cults. Whether I think they're zany or not, it's irrelevant. And up until recently, they still had a draft, although that's been, within the last year, done away with. And the retort is never, oh, you're right, those are problems, that's correct, we should abolish that. The Germans invariably say, well, I support all those things. Like, we shouldn't have free speech, we shouldn't have real freedom of religion, we shouldn't allow people to be homeschooled because they might be mistaught, as if that can't happen in state schools. Anyway, that's a whole other video, but what it got me thinking about is how interesting that the elephant in the room in these discussions with Germans about authoritarianism and government is obviously Hitler. And I started to think, isn't it interesting that the person who is reviled as the worst person in history happens to have just died, 60 years ago, 65, almost 70 years ago, 76 years ago. Isn't it amazing that in the whole span of history, the person who is hated the most just happens to have just died? And it happens to be so well documented. I mean, there are videos of him and speeches, a book by him, which, by the way, you cannot buy or sell in Germany. You can read it if you get it from the library, apparently. But that's about it. And then I immediately thought, well, there's no way that this is a coincidence. Actually, what it is it's a fact that who you consider the most evil person in history is more a reflection on you and your circumstances, the times you live in, than any kind of objective attempt to analyze all the potential candidates for that title and selecting one on some criteria other than your own biases. So Hitler is the worst person and to most Westerners with their current zeitgeist, because to most Westerners today, I include in here Americans, Germans, you have to be, one of the worst sins that you can commit is to be racist. And since he was explicitly racist, there's no denying that at all. That makes him pretty evil. And then a subset on that, it's a little debatable, because whether Judaism is a race or religion is something you can never get a straight answer on. He was anti-Semitic. That's also true, without question the case. And that is, if not worse than racism, at least a separate, equally evil and perhaps greater evil than just regular racism. And he was that as well. And then all the killing people, he hardly stands apart in that sense, but that's just icing on the cake. And so he's the worst, even though there are at least one or two other people who've actually killed more humans who are contemporaries of him. So Stalin and Mao. So I'm not reaching back into history to where no one's ever heard of it. Everyone's heard of Joseph Stalin and Mao, but since they weren't so explicitly racist, although I think you can find racism in both of them a little bit, although I don't know that much about Mao, I'll admit. That's not so antithetical to the current, I don't want to reuse the same term, but zeitgeist or societal preferences, so they're not as condemned. But if you do look at history, you'll note that the phenomenon of selecting somebody is singling out somebody as being uniquely bad or evil is pretty common. And there have been many other people who have claimed the throne a lot longer than Hitler has so far. You've got people like Napoleon was on this list for a long time. Many, if not most, of the various emperors of the Roman Empire have this position, from Caesar to Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian. All of them had enemies, and these enemies tended to see them as evil. Among many Jews and among many early Christians, many of the early emperors really did appear to be something akin to the Antichrist. This obviously would be, well, the emperorship actually predates Christianity by a couple years. And so, yeah, early Christians, but later Zionists, like the Zealots who died at Masada, they kind of thought that they were in an end times and that the emperor was something of an Antichrist. Attila the Hun, his name is actually very well known, although his particular niche in society is not that unique. He was the ostensible leader, the king, really more of the chief mafia don of one of the innumerable barbarian hordes that menaced the late Roman Empire in the early Middle Ages. It astounds me to the degree to which he has achieved fame over the competing heads of hordes. I mean, there's Theodoric and Odoacer and any number of other chieftains who did bad things as well, and for some reason he has been singled out, and he has the moniker the Scourge of God. And I mean, he was somebody I knew about a long time ago when I was very young, and I'm sure most people have heard of him, even though he died in, I think, 454 or 455, maybe 457. Didn't live that long, and I mean, really, I think he should be someone who's obscure, but for the early Christian church, the early Catholic Church, which had just been established in Rome, he was a big threat, and they really demonized him, and that has come down to us. But you can go further back and say, the Bible talks about, say, the kings of Assyria or the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar or Sennacherib, as being, inherently evil because they sacked Jerusalem. And so we remember them for being evil for that. But on the other hand, no one considers Cyrus to be that evil because he allowed the Jews to return from exile into Israel. And even though he waged many more wars than, say, Sennacherib or Nebuchadnezzar and established a far larger empire that despoiled the people they conquered, oftentimes worse than the Assyrians or Babylonians ever did, we don't have the perspective of the Egyptians he despoiled or the Babylonians he despoiled or the Lydians or the Carians or Gyges or Croesus, the kings in Asia Minor that he defeated. We have the biblical account, and so he's good in our eyes, even though from other perspectives he would be considered evil. But I think what just needs to be said about this is the activity of rulers of states and states just generally butchering people, mostly their political rivals, is totally and unfortunately unextraordinary. It's very, very common. And The only thing that really differentiates, that allows a Hitler or a Stalin to kill so many more, is circumstance. It's not that Hitler is actually, as an individual, a worse person than any number of innumerable criminals. And I just listed the more powerful, famous ones, but even very petty monarchs and very small governments have been absolutely bloodthirsty. It's very routine for states and even individuals, although it's a lot less rare. I mean, if you look, the aggregate of human individuals, only a small minority are ever going to be murderers. If you look at the aggregate of states, a high percentage, I would say a majority, if not a supermajority, engage in conspicuous amounts of bloodletting. And even the minor states that don't do a lot of this outstretch even the worst homicidal serial killers. But I don't think there's any basis for saying that Hitler is uniquely evil, or Stalin, or Mao, but then Caesar Augustus is not that bad, really, or Sennacherib's not that bad, or King George. I mean, King George, if you read the Founding Fathers, they seem to think he was a pretty bad guy. Although, for some reason, he is not vilified that often in America today, really at all. I mean, this is kind of another little bit of a tangent, but in our new civic religion, King George is not the most evil person. Actually, Hitler is. Hitler or the South. Although, there again, for some reason, Jefferson Davis is usually not vilified. I mean, if you come out and you say you like Jefferson Davis, then people will say you're a racist or you're a neo-Confederate. But there's not a lot of depicting him as evil or referencing him as evil, which is, I think, fair, because I don't think he was that evil. He was in the state, and the Confederate States did bad things, and he did bad things personally, like owning slaves. But I mean, he pales compared to his canonized contemporary Abraham Lincoln, who was much more of a tyrant and killed far more people than Jefferson Davis ever did, but he's lauded. So for me personally, when I look at bad people, bad government heads, the numbers they kill are just kind of, I think that's more of a reflection on the societies that they live in than on themselves. There have been other tyrants who didn't get that far because they got overthrown or they were assassinated, like Julius Caesar, for instance. I think it speaks well to Rome, and I don't lionize Rome. Rome had a lot of problems, but that there was even a notion that there should not be tyrannical power, and that this culminated in tyrannicide, and the murder of Caesar speaks well to the Romans. So he would have killed more people if Brutus and the other senators hadn't stabbed him to death, without question. I mean, he was literally 4 days away from invading the Parthian Empire. Not that I love the Parthian Empire, but I wonder how many people didn't die because one tyrant got stabbed to death. But nobody stabbed Hitler to death, although lots of people tried, so I guess we can exonerate them a little bit. Nobody killed Stalin, or at least there's some people who think that maybe he was eventually killed when he was in his 70s, but how long did it take before he was ousted? How much mass homicide and genocide do these societies tolerate before they do something about their governments? And that's, I think, a more interesting question. Could it happen here? How much would we tolerate? It seems like we tolerate a whole lot, but I think there is a bit of a catch, because a lot of the worst things we tolerate are foreign things, and they don't use predator drones to kill people in the United States yet. They are using them though for surveillance, so who knows? Maybe that Rubicon has been crossed. The other criteria I look at is just how are they personally? And I've always felt that Hitler wasn't that bad a guy personally. He seemed to have loyalty to a certain extent. If he thought you were a friend, he would respect you. There are a number of people who actually would stand up to him, and he didn't hate or decide needed to die, but would say, okay, I appreciate that you know what you're talking about. And somebody who had at least some charm. What he did was horrible, but if you believe in autarky, if you believe that every state should have within its borders all the resources it needs, something that, by the way, many people, including many liberals, still believe, then what he did was perfectly logical. Germany lacks all the resources that it could possibly want, so it makes sense for them to acquire them that way. If you believe in autarky, now I believe in free trade. I think it's a simple choice there. But if you look at someone like Stalin, he had no personal loyalty. In fact, if you were close to him, that basically meant you were next on the get executed list. And Hitler, while he assassinated his political rivals, which again is like the normal thing that happens politically, there are cases of exile and sometimes mutilation. It used to be a big thing in the Byzantine Empire and other Middle Eastern societies to mutilate your rivals, so maybe cut off their nose or gouge out their eyes or cut out their tongue or something like that, which I guess is not quite as bad as homicide, but it's not very good either. But yes, he killed his political rivals, and he targeted the Jews, and he targeted communists, so no big deal there, really, at least in most cases, not always, I guess. And he targeted Bolsheviks generally, and he treated Russian prisoners really bad. But Germans didn't treat American or British prisoners very bad. No, not at all. They were actually fairly humane. They took seriously the admonitions of the Red Cross and their international treaties that they had with the United States and Great Britain. And by and large, they took, as well as ever happens, took care of those prisoners. Yes, there are examples. There was a famous massacre during the Battle of the Bulge where like 70 POWs were gunned down, which has been immortalized in probably umpteen Hollywood movies, demonized. But I've actually had World War II vets tell me that they remember gunning down 10 times that many German prisoners at certain points, so hardly stands out. But if you look at someone like Stalin, here's somebody who would condemn his own soldiers to death by prolonged torture and starvation in the Gulag system for the mere act of not dying on the front lines or being captured. And so I look at someone like Stalin as just personally much worse, and ancillarily he killed more people anyway. So I think it's a moot point, honestly, who's the worst. It doesn't really matter. Any homicide is in principle just as evil as multiple homicides, as long as they're unjustified. I mean, self-defense, that's different. And the people who top the list in terms of numbers, they're just, I don't want to say victims, they're the result of circumstances. The despots of antiquity could not have killed tens of millions of people because there weren't that many people within their physical grasp or even their comprehension. I mean, maybe the Romans, they controlled tens of millions of people, but the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, they never did that. They couldn't even conceive of that many people, let alone kill them all or have the practical ability to do so. But that doesn't mean the monarchs of those kingdoms wouldn't have been happy to do so. I mean, one monarch who gets a lot of grief, again, because he's in the Bible, is Ramses II, although there's some debate over whether the historical Ramses II is the same one that they're talking about in Exodus. But I have no doubt that somebody like Ramses would be perfectly willing, whether the historical one or the biblical one, either way, to exterminate this or that group. But I don't, and so he's not any better than Hitler. I mean, Hitler thinks that that Germany needs to have all these resources to have a good economy. The Pharaoh thinks that the Nile won't flood and the sun won't rise if he doesn't get to have a monopoly on everything, total legal authority to do whatever he wants. And so if he just decides to murder tens of thousands of people, or at least thousands of people, either through war, or conquest, or just through some kind of mass capital punishment, that's just as bad as what Hitler did, except in scale, but he just didn't have the power. There weren't that many people. But there's no reason to suggest that someone like Ramses II, where he offered the ability to kill that many people, that he would even bat an eye at it. Because what's the difference between killing one innocent person and 10 innocent people? There isn't one. So I think the insistence on vilifying someone like Hitler over all others, or whoever it is that you pick, is really more a reflection of what you value, and then you're picking the antithesis of that as something to criticize. So if you are a Christian or you're a Jew, then it makes sense to point out people who persecuted Christians or Jews, like Attila, or Nebuchadnezzar, or Ramses. If you are a multiculturalist liberal who believes in democracy and you don't like explicit hierarchy, then you can point to Hitler, but not really so much to Stalin, certainly not to the ancient Athenians. But, I mean, if you're a libertarian, you have your work cut out for you because you're going to be pointing your finger at a whole lot of people. But, all right, that's it.